Welcome. Today is the 5th of May, 2017, Cinco de Mayo in some places, and we're on the road traveling where we've just finished a conference on the English Reformation at St. John Fisher, and you'll find that, put a link down below, and while on the road, we're joined by Father Chad Ripperger. Father Ripperger, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for helping me, and happy feast day of St. Pope Pius V.
Amen. Just as St. Pius V had to deal with the onslaught of Islam, as well as the spread of error throughout Europe, today we're dealing with the onslaught of a good number of errors.
Yeah.
The first one is, and we're seeing it more and more in popular media, the Marvel Cinematic Universe just expanded last year with Doctor Strange, where they introduced the Multiverse. And so many of the elements in modern cosmology of the idea that all these alternate universes and they all balance the order of the universe. I even forget how that even works. What exactly is the multiverse and how does it square up with traditional Catholic and Thomistic cosmology?
Well, at least in the context of understanding what a multiverses are from what I've read, it's varying theories that we live only in one universe and that there's other universes out there that live in either different dimensions or things of this sort in such a manner that either their physical laws or the various things that govern them are different from our own universe, although a lot of times are considered parallel universes as well. The very term multiverse is actually, or having more than one universe is in fact on a philological level, actually not accurate. The fact of the matter is that universe already itself encompasses the totality of God's creation. So if there were other dimensions or things of this sort, which I'll get to that in a minute, if there were other dimensions, the fact of the matter is they would all be considered part of the one universe. So there's not multi-universes. That itself is just philologically not doable. As far as having universes that have different kinds of laws and things of that sort, were very often the result of trying to solve certain scientific problems about how they would explain, for example, the claim that matter goes in and out of existence and things of this sort. So and also how to deal with certain things like time and things of that sort, and how it's structured, the possibility that, like I said, there's these parallel universes, and that, certain things can kind of happen where in one part of the universe of one affects our universe at a certain point in time and things of this sort. So the point being is that two things. One is that this is all scientific speculation. The second thing is that, and this is something that I think that might be helpful for your listeners, is the recognition of the fact that much of the scientific speculation is actually based on philosophical presuppositions. So we're not actually talking about an area, the speculation that there might be other universes is in fact a philosophical speculation, because there's no way to verify these things empirically and things of this sort. But it's not, and so that the empirical science and even like mathematics, as one friend of mine said to me many years ago, even mathematics very often is based upon a philosophical set of presuppositions regarding the structure and nature of the universe. So even your mathematics is structured upon your cosmology. And so what's slowly kind of happening is in addition to having a non-realistic approach to science, in which science is there to verify reality, to come to knowledge of reality, people are starting in their heads more rather than actually proceeding to, or looking at reality and then trying to make a theory that would actually fit reality. They just create this stuff in their head and then see if it will actually fit reality later, if they even get to that step as well. So that all being said, like a perfect example has to do with the nature of time, which is kind of interesting because what happened with Einstein, and actually which has a precursor to Kant, which I'll talk about here in a minute, was a deviation from a Thomistic / Aristotelian understanding of time, which had been predominant up until about the time of to Kant. Einstein wrote a letter to Bohr at one point during his career after having read Kant. So much of the Einsteinian science, or we could say much of the Einsteinian cosmology, actually comes from a Kantian understanding, a Kantian epistemology, if you will. And he wrote to Bohr, and he just said, given what Kant has written about the structure and nature of time and space and various other categories, that as a result of that, basically we can base our mathematics on that rather than on what went before us. So, for example, in relationship to Kant ends up saying that, taking it from Descartes, so with Descartes' initial skepticism, which he never really recovers from because later authors kind of call him on the carpet about that, doubting the senses and things like that, you get cut off from the world. That coupled with Hume's critique of causation, saying that it's just constant conjunction. When we see a ball hit another ball, we just see two balls moving. We don't know if one actually causes the other. That results in, epistemologically, my senses may or may not be telling me being caused by what's external to me, and as a result of that, I'm actually really cut off from reality. And that's what Kant realized. If you accept the epistemology of Descartes with the critique of causation from Hume, you're basically stuck in your head. And as a result, he ends up saying that he basically wants to recoup a little bit of Aristotle's, the categories in some manner, because they seem kind of useful. So instead what he ends up doing is, instead of them being categories of beings of real things, like time governing something external to us, instead what happens is time and space, which they often called, after Descartes, extension. These get to be, they're categories that the mind imposes on the person's experience in order to gain some type of understanding or meaning of their experience, but they're not necessarily real. So once that the notion of time becomes a category of the mind imposed, it becomes relative or subjective to the individual. This gets picked up by Einstein, and so as a result of that, he ends up saying that time is relative. That is, to the viewer or to the person who's going through the particular experience or their perspective, rather than a Thomistic or an Aristotelian understanding of time, which is very different. In an Aristotelian or an a Thomistic understanding of time, time is actually defined as the measurement of a corruptible, measurement of motion of a corruptible thing. Each part of that is very key to understanding that. It's of a corruptible thing, because we know through revelation, which is unfortunate that as the empirical sciences go farther and farther away from any kind of realistic and a Catholic understanding of what a science should be, what's happening is that they're deviating and ending up in error, ultimately. We know from our Catholic belief that time had a beginning, that is, at the creation of the universe, and it will have an end when Christ returns. As a result of that, the totality of the continuum of time is one discrete unit. Okay, that being the case, then when we say it's of a corruptible thing, it means that in the mind of St. Thomas, he discusses three different states. There's those of us who are in time, that's being in this life, and time is defined as having a beginning and an end. It began at the creation of the universe, it will end at the return of Christ. Then there's what they call the avum, and that's what the angels are in. It has a beginning, so they were created at a certain point, and it has sequence of events, but it doesn't deal with a corruptible thing. And by corruptible thing, we mean material things that have the capacity of going out of existence. So, like a particular dog might die and it goes out of existence, etc. So they don't have that. So they have a beginning but no end. Once Christ returns, all of us are subsumed into the avum, and so it will not have any end, but time itself comes to an end, which means there's no more corruptible things. Then there's eternity, which neither has a beginning nor an end, and that pertains only to God. Okay, so it's the measurement of motion of a corruptible thing. The motion, it's the measurement of motion, and that measurement of motion is of two kinds. The first is a kind of system or a standard or a rule, if you will, that we use in order to get a sense of how much of the passage through the continuum of time has actually lapsed. So, for example, I can look at the clock says 12 o'clock. An hour later, it says 1 o'clock. And then I notice that, so then there's been a passage through a continuum based upon that of 1 hour. And so we put discrete units on it. So that's one measurement. That's actually not exactly what time, when you're talking about the actual accident of time as it exists in material things. Rather, what time is when we talk about measurement, we're thinking here more of the term regula in Latin, which is a kind of a rule or a thing that governs the matter in some particular way. So in this particular case, time would actually be almost like a law or a structure that God puts into matter to govern its passage from the beginning of time to the end through this continuum. Now, the one thing that Einstein did get right in a certain sense is that the passage through the continuum can change based upon how fast you go. So the faster you go, the faster you pass through as far as your actual physical motion, the faster you pass through the continuum. So that's that part he got right. But that doesn't mean that time is relative in the sense of that you're at a different time that I'm at a certain specific time. Rather, so like for example, he does the thought experiment of, if I speed up, I'm going to pass through time at a different rate. So if I'm put in a spaceship and I go almost the speed of light, I'm going to pass through time at a different rate than say someone here on Earth. Now, the thing is that it's not that there's not absolute time in a certain sense, because we know there's an absolute time because there's a beginning and an end, and so you can measure where you're at in that continuum based upon the beginning and the end. So there is, in a certain sense, an absolute time in that process. However, the passage through the time is relative. That is, how quickly you actually pass through it. Now, Aristotle, so the other thing that we often credit Einstein for is that motion is relative. So it's possible for one thing to be conceived as standing still and another thing moving around it, or vice versa. And he says that basically motion is relative to the individual's perspective. This is again rooted in the Kantian epistemology. In point in fact, Aristotle already dealt with the fact that motion was relative. However, we also know that there's also, in a certain sense, an absolute motion, because the created universe is a finite thing. It's not infinite, and therefore within the context of this cosmology of an infinite, of a finite thing, there is absolute motion in relationship to that finite thing, even though it's relative. Say, between you and me, Ryan, there might be relative motion in relationship to the two of us. The fact of the matter is that in the context of this, there's kind of an absolute motion. So that all being said, the understanding of this cosmology of, time being relative, is actually not time being relative, it's actually the passage through the continuum is what's relative in relationship to the individual based upon how fast he's going. There does seem to be one particular entity that is immune from this passage through time, and that seems to be the church, because of the fact that we seem to be stuck in the 60s. I say this tongue-in-cheek a bit, but there's a certain truth in it. We're stuck in the 60s. They keep telling us through this, the idea of the aggiornamento, that we should really be getting up to modern man and that type of thing. But in point in fact, the vestments are still from the 60s, the Mass is from the 60s, the architecture is from the 60s, even the moral and philosophical and theological discussions are now still revolving around problems that they thought existed in the 60s.
Music.
What's that? Music is from the 60s. So we haven't got, and if their principle is that, we should be keeping up with modern times, okay, that's fine, but the 60s were 50 years ago, and this is 50 years later, a half a century later. We need to put the things from the 60s in the past, if that's their principle, which I, of course, don't agree with. I think that the church's teachings, of course, are perennial, but also the fact that man's problems are perennial. Human nature doesn't change. We're all suffering from original sin. Those don't change. In fact, if anything that modern history has told us is that human nature has not changed. Anyway, that all being said, I think that these cosmologies are dangerous for two reasons. One is that it can start giving people in the Catholic theology a impression that somehow or another they have to conform to these modern theories. You see that these things are theories. For example, when they came out with string theory and things of this sort, it was immediately touted as this is what it looks like and this is what it is, but then it quickly fizzled in the scientific community. And that, as one scientist once said, is that what we consider to be the foundation of science changes every 10 years. So the point being is that people have to be careful to try and conform their theology or some particular aspects of theology to those things. The second thing is to realize from a philosophical point of view that the philosophy of science is such that there is a necessity for even the empirical sciences in the philosophical presuppositions which govern them, that they have to be conformed to a realistic epistemology and a realistic metaphysics and cosmology. In my view, it should be Thomistic, or at least at a minimum Aristotelian.
Well, they are actually wedded to preset metaphysics or epistemology or what have you, even if they just don't admit it or acknowledge it. It's just simply not a Thomistic one.
Yes, that's correct. And that's the thing that people have to realize, is that the sciences are founded or based upon, the empirical sciences specifically, are founded on philosophical presuppositions, and those are the ones that we have to give serious analysis to. So even when you look at the whole question of evolution, you're seeing that there's a set of presuppositions, philosophical presuppositions, that are in place, that we have to preclude God as part of the discussion, even though you can know God through the natural light of reason through philosophy, as Vatican I has defined. There is also certain other things, but there's certain presuppositions that are actually present in the empirical science. And so even the science, even when you analyze, whether the science is logical and things of that sort, you still have to go back to these presuppositions and give those serious philosophical analysis.
And let's backtrack to one thing that you had mentioned. So in critiquing the cosmology that's in play with the multiverse and time, especially in Einstein's thought, you mentioned back to Aristotle, and of course, again, we know there's a beginning and we know there's an end. But in Aristotelian cosmology, Aristotle had held that matter was eternal. Basically, and which it seems to me in my reading that he thought it would solve various problems that Plato couldn't solve.
Correct.
And so, how does that fit in then? Because there wouldn't be a beginning and end point, except possibly a sequence where the mover starts moving, but it's always going.
Right. Yeah, I think that just a couple of things is, one is that St. Thomas says in his discussion of De Aeternitate Mundi, he says that ultimately we don't know whether time has a beginning or an end, or that whether matter is eternal or not, except through revelation. Now, why is this important? Now, some people are going to squeal and say, well, hey, wait a minute. You can't use theology or revelation as a foundation of your empirical science. Okay, there is a certain sense in which that's true, but there's a certain sense in which it's not true. The theology still has to be used as kind of a negative principle, so to speak, in relationship to the science. In other words, if the science starts presuming certain philosophical and certain philosophical positions which are at variance with Catholic theology, we know eventually that science is going to deviate from the truth anyway, because as Aristotle says, a small error in the beginning becomes great in an end. So, and this is what St. Thomas would always use in relationship to philosophy. We know, even though you can reason things out through the natural light of reason, the fact of the matter is that you can have theology that kind of keeps a check on that particular thing. So, when you're talking about Aristotle and the idea of the world being eternal, or that matter being eternal, we only really know that that's not true in light of revelation. However, there are some philosophical arguments that argue that it had to have at least some kind of a beginning in time and things of that sort. But St. Thomas himself says we're not, those appear that they might work, but in point in fact we don't have certitude about that except through revelation. But this is an important point, because Catholics need to realize that as science deviates more and more from a Catholic understanding of things, this is kind of the approach that you're going to start seeing, is a recouping of things being eternal. But with Aristotle, he was trying to solve specific philosophical problems, whereas the moderns actually, in my own particular view of things, I think they have more of an agenda. They want to preclude God. They want to preclude any possibility of, say, the book of Genesis being true. They want to deny Catholic theology, and so as a result of that, they're actually glumming on to certain philosophical errors regarding these particular things in order to buttress it. And I think this is, nowhere more evident, as I mentioned before, say like in evolution. And even the science is starting to show, and this is where it can become a problem is that the agenda becomes so entrenched that it actually starts to preclude the evidence in relationship to what is valid in relationship to sciences. One of the things that they're actually doing in the modern sciences is that they'll come up with a theory when there's evidence contrary to that. They just name that an anomaly or some abnormality in order to maintain their theory. Whereas the philosophical principle is if there's a single piece of evidence that contradicts your theory, either your theory is wrong in total or in part, and they're just that itself is starting to be ignored in the empirical sciences.
Indeed. Well, we'll have to take our first break so I can have some snuff, the tobacco of choice for popes, kings, and emperors. All right. So now apart from these various scientific things that are, becoming more and more popular through media and through fiction and movies and other things, the next thing that we're bombarded with on a daily basis is transgenderism. We're told now, apparently there are 59 different genders, supposedly, or something of this sort.
Yes, and it keeps being added on to as time goes on.
Yes, indeed. So it seems to me, it should seem, I suppose, to any, maybe I'm bigoted, backward instance of the patriarchy, right? But I'm sorry, but there's only 2 sets of chromosomes, and it seems that what they've done is that, for others, when they replaced on your paperwork the word sex, male and female, with gender. Gender is a grammatical term, meaning which is just meaning this is this type of thing from the Latin word genus, which is just the type of a thing.
Right.
And so it's a masculine, feminine, and neuter. In grammar, it's just what the thing is, and it doesn't have just this kind of thing. And so it doesn't have any rhyme or reason. It's not really connected to anything. Some languages have principles that govern it, some don't. But biology is governed by something, namely you've got the same set of chromosomes.
Right.
So everyone in this sex has it, and everyone in the other sex has it, and that's it. So how did we get here? I guess is one question. How does this work with the church's teaching, and where does it seem like they're going with this in the culture?
Well, I think that part of it has to do with, as you indicate, differentiation. Sexual differentiation is ultimately based chromosomally. A lot of times they'll talk about chromosomal abnormalities, but those particular things actually just are exceptions that actually prove the rule. And basically what that means is that the body-soul composite is such that the body has a specific set of dispositions, St. Thomas says, and this is something that Lord willing, I get my book finished on the psychology of men and women, but that there is a material disposition of which the DNA is part of it, and then the soul, which is the substantial form of the body, defined by the Council of Vienna, states, or St. Thomas talks about how the soul operates through the body that constitute one substance, but the activities of the soul depend upon the material disposition of the body. What does this mean concretely? It means that once you have a set of chromosomes, the soul begins developing the body according to that chromosomal structure in order to be able to perform those activities that are proper to it. Now, that means then that even though the natural law is such that we have natural inclination, so for example, men and women have a natural inclination to conjugal relations with the opposite sex, right? So that means then, therefore, that what that finality is, okay, so that's the general category of natural inclination, but within that there's a specificity based upon the disposition and how the soul is actually, the body is structured and how the soul is going to operate that. So once the animation occurs at the time of conception, the soul begins to develop in the body so that the structure can fulfill that finality based upon the material disposition. So women will then have a natural inclination towards having conjugal relations with men and men with women. So what happens is so then from that structure, that disposition, and how the soul develops the body through that process, through the augmentative faculty, St. Thomas calls it, the specificity of the natural inclinations, that is, the natural law becomes more specified in relationship to a particular individual, in relationship to the dispositions and the chromosomal structure that they actually have. Okay, what does this mean? It means, therefore, that once that structure occurs, the psychology, which we know because men and women's brains are actually structured different, they're physiologically structured different, and as a result of that, that structure is ordered towards a specific set of activities that is more proper to one sex or another. Okay, what does all this mean? It means that some of the roles, not all the roles of men and women, are designed, that women are designed for certain roles other than men, and vice versa, because of the structure that they actually have. What happened is at Descartes, and I don't mean to pin everything on him, but when he basically began anew, because the Council of Vienna again said that the soul is a substantial form of the body. So when people say I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, that's absurd. Gender, according to St. Thomas, is not in the soul. I know that's a popular theory that there's actually male souls and female souls. This is completely contrary to the philosophical tradition in the Church. That in point in fact, that gender is in the body, and that the soul develops it according to the bodily dispositions. And then there's after Descartes, when basically it's the soul simply becomes kind of like what Plato said, that the soul is the thing that guides the ship, but that the ship and the soul are distinct. And you see this in other philosophical traditions, that the body and the soul don't constitute a single thing. So it's not possible, because of the Church's condemnation of the idea at Vienna that the soul is not the substantial form of the body, which means that the soul is the substantial form of the body. That means, therefore, that you can't say I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, because of the fact that that's making this division between the soul and the body. And this is what happens after Descartes with his whole process of his epistemology and everything, where the real individual is the soul and the thoughts and things of that sort, rather than the actual body-soul composite. That division that happens as a result of rationalism then begins to provide, and we're seeing this in our modern culture, where that rationalism is taking over, where people don't feel that they're their bodies, and so you get guys who say, like I said, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body. That coupled with the materialism, where there's no natural law, there's no structure, and so to this ultimately, or there's no meaning behind the structure and nature of the faculties, there's no finality to them, and so as a result you can determine these things on your own. Then what happens with the materialism is that you can just manipulate the body any way that you want. So the two, ironically, in many people's philosophical interpretation, are opposites, rationalism and materialism, which actually, if you look at Hume, he's really very heavily rationalistic in a lot of his things. These opposing things come together in a system that's not coherent. That is, it doesn't adhere to the principle of coherence. That is, they don't fit together, and so they can't be true. But this is one of the things that's actually happening with that in relationship to transgenderism, is this division between who the person is and what they actually are. And I think that's one of the problems, that the term gender is taking on more and more of a rationalistic type of meaning or impression, rather than the recognition of a Thomistic / Catholic understanding of the fact that there's a natural law, man is a body-soul composite, and that from this natural inclinations arise. That's all being put aside. St. Thomas says, well, how do we get to this point where, he doesn't ask this specific question, but he says, how is it that the natural inclinations can become eclipsed? So, for example, one of the natural inclinations is the first category of natural inclination, which is the preservation as your being, or the conservation of your being as it is. How can it go from, we have this natural inclination, to a person actually wanting to undergo through a transgender operation where there's various organs removed and things of this sort? And in fact, even in some of the more extreme cases, we're actually seeing in psychology where there's people who feel that they have to have their arm physically removed from themselves and things like that in order for themselves to feel complete. How do people get there? And he says that the natural law inclinations can be eclipsed by sin. That is, habitually we choose things contrary to the truth, and so as a result we become intellectually dumbed down. And as a result of that, it can start to change our patterns or habits of judgment, and so we start thinking things contrary to it. It can also happen through formation, which I think is happening in our culture, where kids going through public school systems and things of this sort are being taught these things, so the formation is affecting their judgment and therefore eclipsing the natural inclination that actually occurs.
Although I think I rather fancy I'm a rich man trapped in a poor man's body. So
Yes.
rich people end the hate. Send me your money.
Yeah, well, I'm waiting for someone to say, I'm a saint trapped in a sinner's body.
Yeah. So moving on from that, Martin Scorsese just produced his film Silence, based on a 1959 Japanese novel about Jesuits in Japan. And we should preface it with the theme of the movie did not actually happen. In fact, rather, the Jesuits in Japan at Nagasaki were martyred, and a good number before that. So, nevertheless, he depicts Jesuits that for the need to save their community from the imperial authorities, that they had to basically deny the faith, apostatize from the faith. Now, St. Alphonsus says, on the other hand, in the publication of his Moral Theology, which actually we just completed into English, by the way, in no case may one deny the faith, whether by words or by another sign, by the saying of Christ, whoever will deny me before men, etc. However, it is not lawful to lie, or to feign that which is not. Yet, on the other hand, one may dissimulate what is, or cover the truth with words and other ambiguous signs, and different things on account of a just cause. And there is not a necessity, when there is not a necessity to affirm the faith. And this is the common opinion of St. Thomas and other authors, etc. So, is St. Alphonsus correct? Or have we kind of gotten to a point where, if someone's in this situation, he can, just to save someone else, he can apostatize from the faith?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a good question given the current circumstances that we're actually living in. By way of anecdote, I think that the Scorsese movie is very unfortunate. The first two acts of the movie are actually fantastic, providing a very rich and beautiful understanding of the propagation of the faith and that type of thing. And then at the third act is where the problem really is, where the priest is going to have to step on this image of Christ in order to, and then he goes through this, he's not sure if he should or shouldn't, and that type of thing, and there's this lack of clarity. The fact of the matter is that the ends never justify the means. You can never, commit an act of apostasy in order to save anything. There's that. But the other thing is that St. Alphonsus is correct, which, by the way, I would commend your putting out of that first volume of St. Alphonsus' translation, which I'm sure will have a big impact. And St. Alphonsus is completely consistent with the entire tradition, St. Thomas included, in this question, is that under certain circumstances you are not obligated to say something that would cause them to actually kill you, or you can remain silent, or you can dissimulate. Now, dissimulate is a technical moral term, which basically means you can do something or say something that is true, but the person's going to be deceived, which is different from lying, which is saying something false, or fraud, which is doing something false in order to deceive. So, and it's a very different, and the morals have that. In later modern theological manuals, dissimulation was labeled mental reservation. Can you do something where you have this mental reservation? And in point in fact, under certain circumstances, yes, you can. However, there are certain circumstances where it becomes clear where the silence itself will be automatically construed as apostasy. And so you can't, under those particular circumstances, you can't. And that actually brings up a very important point, which has been really lost. And it's one of the unfortunate difficulties with the document Amoris Laetitia, which is, in the document, it states that St. Thomas says there's these general principles, but then it says that the principles don't apply everywhere in all cases. In fact, he says the principles just don't apply in the concrete. That's actually not what St. Thomas says. If you look at exactly what St. Thomas says, he says there's general principles, and there's certain principles that apply everywhere and in all cases. So, for example, a moral precept that you can't, let's just use a principle instead. Do good and avoid evil applies everywhere and in all cases. But then St. Thomas says there's certain principles that apply mediating the circumstances. So, for example, fraternal correction. You have the obligation to correct somebody, but how that obligation is applied in the concrete is based on various principles. That is, the principle of the necessity of bringing someone to salvation, the principle that a thing is received according to the mode of the receiver. So if the person is not receptive to the correction, you're just going to make it worse. And so as a result of that, those principles would end up governing, when you would say something to correct somebody and when you're not. So in the relationship to correcting somebody, there's always in these cases where the general principle may not apply in the concrete. It doesn't mean that in the concrete circumstances some principle doesn't govern our understanding of that. In other words, in the concrete, there is always a moral principle that governs that particular thing. And so as a result of that, we have to recognize that it's prudence, especially supernatural prudence in the case of fraternal correction, is what governs our grasping of which principle applies based on which circumstance in order to do that. Whereas other circumstances, it just simply applies everywhere and in all cases. So in the case, to get back to the whole thing of when, you could remain silent and when you can't is governed by different circumstances to see which principle applies as to whether, say, you can use dissimulation or not in a particular circumstance.
Right. There was an article in the Latin Mass magazine some years ago, about a decade or so ago, which addressed the principles of praying with non-Catholics. It was by a certain Craig Allen.
Right.
And it had said essentially that you can't pray with non-Catholics, citing numerous decisions of the Congregation of the Propaganda, Fidei, which the article held were still binding.
Right.
Now, we just mentioned St. Alphonsus, and in the same question on whether whether one could deny the faith under any circumstance, and he takes up again whether one could listen to the sermons of heretics, and that time that just means Protestants in those times,
right.
For the most part, or Socinians or something like that. Whether you could listen to the sermons of heretics or assist in catechism in any way, would you be able to do this? So he cites a couple of authors that say yes, but he rejects it, and it makes mention that when he was the Bishop of Naples, he presided over a synod that purposely, expressly forbade anyone to assist with sermons, catechisms, and any rites of heretics for any pretext whatsoever, and put a reserved excommunication on it, ipso facto, which then he cites as the opinion he sides with.
Mm-hmm.
So is this communicatio in sacris, the assisting in the rites of heretics, is this something that's just simple, like this is what St. Alphonsus favors, but these other guys look at it this way, and modern church practice, of course, obviously seems to favor the opposite. But then favor going ahead and assisting in these rites. But then you see the fathers and the English martyrs especially, some were said, oh, just go to one Anglican service and we won't kill you. And they wouldn't do it. Right. Or St. Margaret Clitheroe, she declared that some Anglicans felt it was a tragedy that she was going to be put to death, and they say, hey, let's pray together. And they said, no. She said, no. You say your prayers, and I will not say amen to your prayers, and you will not say amen to my prayers. So where can we find the formal teaching on what we should be doing here?
Well, it's interesting that you say that you won't say amen to my prayers either, because even it reminds me of the quote from St. Hippolytus, who says, if you have a wife that's not Catholic, you are forbidden to pray with her. You go and pray separately from her, and then you come and tend to her, which is your duty. So the propagation for the faith said that communicatio in sacris, that is, engaging in any type of worship or prayer or anything like that, with anything sacred, rites or anything of that sort with non-Catholics, was forbidden by the divine positive law, which means Scripture. It's in Scripture that you're not permitted to do so. Second, and also it's part of the tradition, which I'll talk about here in a minute. The second thing is it's part of the natural law, even the natural law, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. Not even the Pope can dispense from it. And that it is, if you do so, you have to go to confession, which is language for saying it's morally sinful. Okay. How did they end up with that? Well, all they were doing was basically stating what the entire tradition of the church had actually said. The fathers of the church are unanimous. You can't do this. The theologians, that is, those alive from 1100 to 1750 roughly, are the theological schools, all hold to this as well. The propagation of the faith is simply explicating those things which just simply went before. And so in that article by Craig Allen, the propagation of the faith states the principles, and then you just see the series of rulings about how those principles are applied. Okay, so in fact, we know even up until 1939, when certain theologians were asking Pius XII, if I'm not mistaken, were asking Pius XII if they could go to ecumenical meetings, he finally said, well, you can go, but you are forbidden any form of communicatio in sacris. After that, it becomes a bit dicey, and it has to do with a series of understandings of the church, which is actually going to be in a book that I'm working on right now called The Principle of the Integral Good. I'm going to be dealing with how they got to the point where you could actually pray with non-Catholics, but the general principle that you couldn't have communicatio in sacris with someone who didn't adhere or wasn't a member of the church that Christ had founded is still actually even in play, even in some of the church's documents. Okay, so going back to this, in relationship to the part of Revelation, basically what it boils down to is, or part of tradition, basically what it boils down to is this. When you're praying, the moral theologians break down the moral act into different what they call fonts or sources. And one of the fonts is the circumstances. And one of the circumstances is called quibus auxiliis, which is by what means. And so what happens is when you pray with someone else, you're actually augmenting the value or the merit of your prayer by means of joining to that particular individual's prayer as well. So that unification actually augments the efficacy of the prayer. We actually know this. Christ said, where two or more are gathered in my name, there I am in their midst. So we know there's something about that. There's something about that. So then the question becomes, why can't I join my prayer to a non-Catholic? Well, it's very simple in this. Or someone who doesn't adhere to what the Church of Christ actually teaches. It's very simple. The person who is outside the visible structure of the church is, in point and fact, by that fact of being outside the visible structure of the church, when they pray, it actually displeases God. If you look at here we're not talking about on a subjective level. We'll look at that in a minute. But objectively speaking, it was the will of God that when he founded the Catholic Church, that all people would come to be members of the Catholic Church, and he gave the apostles all the elements of sanctification and the custody of those, which includes prayer and all those things. So it was his intention that all would worship him within this one structure. So being outside of that is contrary to his mind. The second thing is the fact that they're outside the visible structure of the church means that on an objective level, we have to presume there's some doctrines of the church which they reject. And if you don't have faith, or if you have disordered faith, then when you pray to God, you're actually, not just in the manner of your prayer, but God, to have that rightly ordered prayer, you basically have to have the virtue of faith. And there's something about, on an objective level, we have to presume that there's some doctrine which they actually reject. You're actually joining your prayers to somebody who's doing something on an objective level is offensive to God. And that is something in relationship to their faith or what have you, or in their understanding of how they were to pray and to whether they could actually be members of the church or not in order to pray, etc. Subjectively, people will say, well, subjectively, maybe the person doesn't know and maybe they're good, and that may be true. But we don't have access to that. All we have access is to, and we can't judge that. All we can judge is the externals in relationships to that. So, the moral theologians in the past said to have communicatio in sacris, that is to the quibus auxiliis, that is the means by which you're aiding your prayer, is being joined to something that on an objective level was offensive to God. And as a result of that, you were not permitted to do so. So that was the historical reason as to why we couldn't actually do it, and that's one of the things which I'm hoping that Craig Allen will actually finish, because he expressed his intention of actually doing those two periods. That is, the Fathers of the Church doing an article on that, showing that they were consistent. The theologians of the theological schools who are pretty clear about it. You always have fringe people in particular, but those doesn't mean that there's not virtue unanimity. And then also even some of the theologians after that, up until recently. My own particular thing is eventually I want to talk about how there was a shift, which I don't want to go into because it's a very long, complicated discussion, but there's a shift in ecclesiology, which then opens the door for them to do it after Vatican II.
And a lot of this sounds like what Bishop Athanasius Schneider was just talking about in an interview with a Polish daily, where they asked him again a couple years back he had said that it's necessary for the church to issue a new syllabus of errors. And they asked him, what popular errors are most threatening? He gives this list of 17. Mm-hmm. And among those, number 3 is kind of the thing you're talking, or sorry, number 2 is the one you're talking about, the theory that Christian confessions or other religions are objectively also ways of salvation positively willed by God.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, which is actually contrary to what has been the constant church teaching up until about 50 years ago, and which is also part of the entire tradition, which is that it was God's intention to establish one religion, one church, and one religion on which all would come into it, and that anybody outside of that simply didn't have the ordinary means of salvation. So that in point in fact, those that are outside of that are de facto, on an objective level, subjectively we don't know, but on an objective level, are actually rejecting those things, because the church has those, the church is given the fullness of revelation or fullness of truth in relationship to that, and so as a result of that, the church, if you reject anything of that, you're essentially rejecting some aspect of Christ. And even Protestants used to actually kind of know this. They knew that they couldn't have communicatio in sacris with Catholics and things of that sort, for their own sets of reasons. We know that if as St. Thomas says, if there's one thing of the Catholic Church that you don't accept, that is a formal church teaching that you don't accept, it corrupts your virtue of faith. And we know from Scripture, without faith you cannot be saved. So the point being is that we know that if you reject even just one article of the Catholic Church's teaching, that on an objective level, again, subjectively we don't know, on an objective level, these people are cut off from the ordinary means of salvation, which is the Catholic Church. Yet, objectively speaking, if any Protestant is saved, and this is how they used to talk about it in the past to some degree, it was formulated in different ways, that if a Protestant managed to be saved, it was not because of his religion. It was actually in spite of it, but it had to do with other reasons as to why he might be able to be saved. So, and this is something that I think is a key discussion, because it's not by virtue of their religion. Another thing, and I should probably say this, I know there's a lot of talk about where people say that it's a good thing that, that the Protestants have valid baptism, or that the Orthodox have all these sacraments. In the past, the church had always said, because the elements of sanctification were entrusted to the apostles and therefore their successors, which is the magisterium of the church and the bishops and their successors, that meant that, and they were given custody of it, that meant that they had rights over the elements of sanctification. So any use outside the purview or outside of the control, so to speak, of the magisterium of the church was a grave violation of justice to the magisterium, because they were the ones entrusted with it, not these other people. So in point in fact, historically, when Protestants and these things made use of the sacraments, that was considered gravely offensive to God. Were they valid? Yes. But the fact of the matter is that God took grave offense at the fact that these things were being used outside the church.
In the very same interview with Bishop Schneider, the same place where he's enumerating what would constitute a new syllabus of errors for the church, he adds numbers 9 and 10, doubts about the eternity of hell, and doubts about the real possibility of eternal condemnation to hell of human beings, which would mean de facto that hell is empty. Right. So let's talk about those, as that still seems to have a very strong pull. Why is it that we can't say hell is empty, more or less?
Well, I think the motivation behind wanting to say that is basically emotional and not true charity. I mean, people emotionally, it's a difficult thing to accept the fact that your loved one or other people might end up in hell in this very gruesome and bad situation. But our emotional status, or emotional state, I should say, shouldn't be the thing that determines doctrinal correctness for obvious reasons. But the fact of the matter is that people say, well, God is infinitely merciful. Okay, well, let's parse that out a little bit. Mercy is, as St. Thomas defines it, loosening of the bonds of justice for the good of the individual. Okay, that means in loosening the bonds of justice, there has to be justice. And if a person, if there is nobody in hell, And if there is no eternity of hell, then quite frankly, God isn't just, and then there's no mercy, and so the whole discussion is mute and pointless, quite frankly. But the second component of it is the fact that to have something, when we're talking about God's justice, there has to be a proportion between what a person does and what they receive, ultimately, as a result of that, a punishment or a reward. If it's true that everybody gets to heaven eventually, then, quite frankly, it's unjust to the saints and the martyrs who went under grueling things when Hitler's going to get there just as much as they are, which is a bit absurd. Now, some people say, well, they might get a bit higher place in heaven. Yeah, but the fact is that the reward is ultimately not due to one person, but he still gets it, which is, again, unjust. So there has to be a proportion. The second thing is that with mortal sin, the Church has always taught us, and the theologians have always taught us, that we deviate from our end. We cut ourselves off from God, and so he is simply giving us what latent or proper to our choice. So for God to be properly merciful, there has to be an actual sense of justice. I also think that some of this has to do with just a lack of kind of a historicity, for lack of a better term. If you actually look at the saints throughout history who have actually had experiences of demons and people in hell and things of that sort, and these are not, some people say, well, those are private revelation, maybe, but when it's so consistently across the board and there's a consistency to it, that is something that has to be reckoned with. In my own personal experience as an exorcist, I know for a fact that all you have to do is command the demon to consider the fact that his punishment is eternal, and it bothers him greatly. He suffers tremendously under that idea. We know from Revelation that in point in fact it's eternal. The fact is that Christ refers to hell as where the worm dieth not, and that means that those in hell perpetually, for all eternity, their conscience eats away at them at this evil that they had actually done. And you actually see this in exorcism cases. The demons, their conscience bothers them, even though they would still make the same choice. They have remorse, not in the sense that they would change their position because their will is fixed in evil, which is another point. Part of the Catholic tradition is that those in hell, their will is fixed in evil. They can't choose otherwise. In fact, I actually had that in a case. One demon actually, I said, so let me get this straight. I mean, I'm putting it colloquially, but in the session it was very formal. Let me get this straight. You cut yourself off from God, yes. You knew that this was evil, yes. And you knew this was going to be your punishment, yes. And you would do it again? He said, yes. So the point being is that their will is fixed in evil. There's no way they can make a choice of repentance because of the fact that their will is fixed in evil. Whereas those who go to heaven, their will is fixed in the good. This is why they can't choose to sin. The point being in all of this is that it's part of revelation, it's in Scripture, it's part of the constant teaching of the Church, it's actually in the councils and in the theologians, the fact that the eternity, that the punishment in hell is eternal. It's only because of this idea, of von Balthasar's book, Dare We All Believe That All Men Are Saved, that this idea has been re-resurrected, that in point in fact, we know it's not the case from the Church's practical experience in exorcism and dealing with demons. It's in Revelation, it's in the constant tradition of the Church. So the idea that in the end, hell will be empty is not at all a Catholic position.
So now, you spoke earlier about certain problematic things in Amoris Laetitia in respect to how they were quoting St. Thomas. Yeah. And so speaking, since that document was published, there have been a number of bishops' conferences that have opined that perhaps the divorce and remarriage should now be admitted to communion. And certainly several of the German bishops, the Maltese bishops, and a few others, and with others rising against them. And one of the things they cite, of course, is this distinction between praxis and doctrine, saying, well, yeah, the doctrine, we can't change it, but in praxis, we can be merciful.
Right.
But the problem is, historically in the Church, whenever the praxis was at variance with the theology, men looked at the praxis and immediately judged that was the theology. So
Correct.
In the commissioning of indulgences in the 16th century by Julius II and Leo X, not a single theologian could be found to say that indulgences get you into heaven if you're in a state of mortal sin. Indulgences wipe away your eternal punishment. No, nobody taught that. Nobody would have dared taught that because it would have been heretical.
Right.
But because preachers were going out saying, "Give from the bottom of your hearts, we'll get you into heaven. You'll never go to hell if you do this." Right? People were hearing these things, and Luther is actually not, for all his other problems, he's not far off when he says, the coin and the cup and the soul flies into heaven.
Right.
Right. So people looked at that praxis and made the judgment that that was the teaching.
Correct.
And, which then the Protestants went to impugn when at the beginning of the Reformation. So, given that, can you really ever have a divorce between praxis, no pun intended, between praxis and theology? And moreover, why is it, theologically speaking, mortally sinful to receive communion while you're yourself in a state of mortal sin?
Well, first, let me just make an observation. Built into our intellect by the natural laws is a structure in which is designed for, as St. Thomas says, the natural law commands all the virtues. Now, one of the virtues is prudence. So, and the definition of prudence is, one of the definitions, because there's several, is the application of universal principles in the concrete. So basically what this means is that if I know what if in the concrete circumstances, to know what I'm doing is the right thing to do, it has to be based in principle. St. Thomas observes, and throughout Catholic tradition, various authors observe that it is the moral and doctrinal teaching of the Church, which are the principles that govern, that have to be applied in the concrete, that is, in relationship to the praxis. So this idea that you can have a separation of the praxis from the theology is, quite frankly, morally heretical. You can't, and this is a very important point. The other thing, and this becomes an issue, especially after the council, where basically when they said, well, we want to have a different pastoral approach, what they really were saying is that we wanted to have a different moral approach. How you behave has latent moral principles governing it. There's always a principle that governs what you do. So let me give you an example, or let me just parse that out a little bit, would be probably the better way to put it. The fact of the matter is every time you do something, it's based on something you know or something you judge, which means there's something that is the foundation for why you're doing what you're doing on an intellectual level. Now, either it's what the Catholic Church believes, or it's because emotionally you find it difficult and squeamish and you really want to have human respect and placate people or what have you. That becomes the principle. It's a false principle, but it's still a principle nonetheless. And so this is one of the things that it has happened, that when they wanted to basically have praxis, which was contrary to doctrinal understanding, what they were really doing is severing that application of prudence in the concrete, but it was governed by other principles which were not Catholic. So there's that. So when you're and this is the thing that's a big problem. In relationship to receiving communion in the state of mortal sin, they say, well, the Church's teaching is one thing, the practice is another. Well, first of all, again, that's moral heresy, because every single action is governed by some moral principle in some manner, and it's either false principle or true principle. But part of the thing that they fail to realize is the very praxis itself is part of divine revelation. It is the very doctrinal or moral teaching of the Church. So, for example, and then we'll parse out a little bit of the theology behind that, St. Paul says that he who receives communion, not judging himself properly, is guilty of the same, which basically means what? And all the fathers of the Church have said that, interpret that mean to receive communion in the state of mortal sin was gravely sinful. So the fact of the matter is the very praxis is in the revelation, so you can't make this distinction. Okay, so the very practice is the Church's moral teaching. And why is that? It's because the very nature of communion is to have union with God. But when you've chosen an action which deviates from that union of God through mortal sin, and historically they used to call sanctifying grace the saving union, that is, it's through sanctifying grace that I have this created participation in divine nature, and therefore have this created union with God in some manner, that in point in fact when I receive communion contrary, and I don't have that, then in point in fact it was sacrilegious. And this is what the Church has always said. In fact, historically, the Church has said that receiving communion in the state of mortal sin was the greatest sacrilege that you could actually commit. which people often misconstrue with, the unforgivable sin of lack of final penitence. That's not, but the actual sacrilege, the worst one that you can commit, is an actual offense directly against God. So that in point and fact, you can't receive communion in the state of mortal sin ever. The Church has said it's an actual absolute. When you apply that to, the divorced and the remarried, that becomes a bit of another question because of the fact that people who are, or at least I should say, they like to say it's a different question, because here they're trying to say, well, practically speaking, these people are living a life that's somewhat stable. They seem to be treating each other well. They seem to, things seem to be going. So as a result of that, we'll take we'll use the internal forum approach. So they just go to confession to their priest. The priest will judge whether he thinks it's okay for them to do it, and then they do it. No. To get divorced and remarried without the Church first giving an annulment, and in addition to that, saying that you can marry this individual without the Church doing that, you're practically speaking in a state of objective mortal sin, because you're basically cohabitating with somebody who's not your wife or your husband. As a result of that, the Church has said if you're in that state, you can't receive communion. As late as John Paul II had actually said that. So the fact of the matter is that the praxis here, the application of it, that you can't receive communion in the state of mortal sin, either they would have to say in the praxis one of two things is the case. One is that the doctrine that the Church teaches that you can't receive communion in the state of mortal sin isn't true, and therefore these people can receive it, which is actually what a lot of theologians hold. Or the person who is that the actual application doesn't apply in this particular case because of these people's state, which is also not the case. Prudence clearly shows us that they're in a state that's objectively mortally sinful, and therefore the principles would still apply.
And lastly, number 16 of Bishop Athanasius Schneider's list of what should make the new syllabus of errors is that he says, quote, confusion about the essential difference of the ministerial and the common priesthood, unquote. So why has this become such a problem? What are the roots of that?
Well, I think the roots are ultimately Protestantism. I think there's also a bit of an intention on the side of certain theologians within the Church to try and obscure these distinctions because of a lack of belief on their part of the distinction between the ministerial priesthood and the priesthood of the laity. I think the first thing we should do is just make this distinction theologically. What are they? Because there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. The ministerial priesthood, St. Thomas says, and the Church says, is an indelible mark. Now, St. Thomas says it's in the intellect. Why is it in the intellect? He says it's in the intellect because the intellect commands certain actions to be done. So in the case of the ministerial priesthood, God infuses an indelible mark in the priest's intellect by which he is able to command the sacraments to occur. He doesn't ask that they occur. He commands them. So when he says, hoc est enim corpus meum, he's not asking Christ, would you make this your body? He's commanding it to become the body and blood of Christ. So it's an actual power that he has in his indelible, in his intellect that gives him that ability to command the sacraments to occur. The lay people, the priesthood of the laity, is not in the sense of an indelible mark in that sense. It is, they don't have that indelible mark in them, which gives them that power and capacity to actually do that. So then, what they do is they do have an indelible mark from baptism. But what's that ordered towards? Okay, well, that's where you get into the distinctions. The indelible mark of the priesthood is ultimately ordered towards offering sacrifice to God, specifically the holy sacrifice of the Mass, in propitiation for the sins of the priest and of the faithful. So it's an action which only the priest can actually confect or bring about. The priesthood of the laity, well, what's a priesthood? The priesthood is, as St. Paul says, a man is chosen from among many to become a priest in order to offer sacrifice to God, right? So the proper function of a priest is to offer sacrifice. Now, a lot of that's gotten blurred and misunderstood because of all the problems within the Church and things of that sort, where they just basically think that a priest is a presider and a facilitator and things of that sort. When in point in fact, his function, his identity is wrapped up in the offering of sacrifice to God for this reason. So the priesthood of laity somehow has to be some means of offering sacrifice. it is not because they cannot offer the same sacrifice that the priest offers because they don't have this indelible mark, so they can't confect the sacrament. But what their priesthood is ordered towards is offering up their offering, which is part of the sacrifice, offering their prayers, sufferings, and good works in union with the sacrifice of the priest, which is the sacrifice at Calvary, in union with that so that it has an efficacy and can actually bring about. That's the nature of the priesthood of the laity, to offer their prayers, sufferings, and good works in union with the sacrifice of the priest. It's not to give out communion. It's not to be reading the readings at Mass. It's not to be in the sanctuary. That's not the nature of the priesthood of the laity. The priesthood of the laity is this ordering of their prayers, suffering, good works in union with the priest's sacrifice to God for the propitiation of their sins and to merit the graces that are necessary for that. I think that the church is going to have to do something about making these things clear. This obviously got, if I remember my history correctly, you're the historian, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but historically this becomes blurred in the Protestant Revolution because they didn't believe in the ministerial priesthood, the sacerdotal priesthood. They just didn't believe in it, and so they actually believed, some of them, that it was the lay people at Mass and their collective faith that caused the confection of the Eucharist and things of that sort. So this is
John Wycliffe had started to go into it, but he held a different view from what eventually would become Luther's, namely that the priests were validly priests, but if they failed to do the job, they would cease to be, and any man could take up the job, regardless of orders. So Luther goes further in his work on the abolition of private Mass, and also in his work De Babylonica Captivitate, on the Babylonian captivity of the Church, where he argues that there's only, first he starts arguing there's 3 sacraments. By the time he's done, there's only 2, right? He says there's only Eucharist, confession, and baptism. Then you get to the end of it, he gets rid of penance, so there's no confession. Even though he still carried it on, it was just a human thing for Luther. So he has that, but so he starts arguing on the same lines we hear today, but everyone's a priest. Everyone is the common ministerial priesthood. So there's no distinction of priests, right? And then he goes on, of course, calling them priest of Antichrist and all this business. But St. John Fisher also, we have this available, and I'll put the link in the notes. It wrote a treatise which we've just republished in English again on the defense of the priesthood, where he takes Luther to task strictly on the basis of the New Testament and the consensus of the Fathers on the New Testament.
Yeah, I think that one of the real problems, to take a bit of a side with this discussion, is that a lack of understanding of the nature of the ministerial or sacerdotal priesthood, and therefore concomitantly a problem with the priesthood of the laity, is rooted in a crisis of understanding of what the nature of a priest is. They don't understand that the principal function of the priest is to offer sacrifice, and so that this indelible mark was given specifically for that sacrifice, and those things which lead up to it, like confession and the other sacraments. This is an important point because now there's a discussion about letting women have access to the diaconessate. It's not diaconate because that's the masculine term. So these would be deaconesses. And usually one of the things they'll tout is, well, they had deacons and deaconesses in the other church. Yes, but the difference is, so we want to talk a little bit about the history, which feel free to add to my history part of this, Ryan. But then there's also the theology. Historically, none of the deaconesses, to my understanding, there was no imposition of hands, but that it was merely a commissioning to do certain things, and they did not serve at the altar, so they weren't really true deacons in the proper sense. Because one of the things that I think is a doctrine that's being attacked in this whole discussion is the fact that this indelible mark of the priesthood is actually by degrees, so that in point and fact, a deacon actually has this indelible mark, but not to the same degree that's necessary to be able to confect the Eucharist. But he has this, and so, and then the priest has it in greater degree, which gives him the capacity to confect it. By some theological accounts, then the bishop has it even more, and that's why he can ordain. Okay, so it's this degree that gives you certain capacities, according to the theologians. That being the case, they say that there's what they call the unity of holy orders. It's the same indelible mark, by degrees. You can't have women become a deacon while denying them the priesthood, because the indelible mark is unified as to its nature. It's just a matter of degree, because it's what? It's order towards sacrifice. So if you're going to assert that a woman can become a deaconess, well, de facto, at a certain point, they're just going to say, well, then they should become a priest, which we already know not to be the case from Ordinatio Sacerdotalis of John Paul II. So the fact, and the entire tradition of the Church, of course. So I think, and my concern is that they'll say, well, they're not going to have, and so that meant that deaconesses can't serve at the altar, because serving at the altar is ultimately consummate with this indelible mark that's given. Okay, so what's going to happen is that at a certain point, they're going to change even the historical practice, if they ever accomplish this, where women will be deaconesses serving at the altar and doing everything that a regular deacon does. That's, I think, their end goal. Whether God permits it or not is another matter. But there's going to be this confusion, further confusion in relationship to this whole discussion.
But it's interesting, too, that, and I saw this in some of the studies, and Cardinal Stickler takes it up a little bit in his book on celibacy, which I think is out of print, sadly, because he goes through a lot of the sources and does a bang-up job on it. But you got to understand a Roman household, even in the East where the Greek-speaking, the vast majority of people are Roman in culture now, because they've been Romanized for at least a couple hundred years. In a Roman household, every free member of the household receives a title of honor confirmed to the paterfamilias, the head of house. So every free member, and if they're feminine, they receive the feminine form of it. Well, and the same relations start taking place in the church by people of relation to a ministry. So as one example, though, because feminists always dig this one out and say, see, women were bishops in their church, right? Well, because Pope, I believe it's Pope St. Martin, there's a fresco of him, and his mother is standing behind him. And then it says Episcopa. But it's because she was a member of the household of Pope St. Martin, the Episcopus Romanus, the Bishop of Rome. And so she's receiving this title as an honorific title because he's Episcopus. She's labeled Episcopa, not by ministry or service, but by honor, because she's in the same household as a free member of the household and not a slave or servant. So the same thing with deaconesses. Because the deacon is understood as intrinsically connected to the action of the bishop in offering Mass, and in this case, baptism. So the deaconess, essentially, because you have the problem with the praxis in the early church, is what was to signify very clearly what's happening in the sacrament of baptism. So the person goes into the baptismal pool naked, as a sign, of course, of his, his destitution. Right? He's being stripped. He's being stripped of the old man. And, being, covered in water symbolizes, of course, death, right? By, sort of like by drowning. And rising again to life. So after you've been baptized, then you receive a white garment as a symbol, the symbol of what's happened in your soul. But what does the bishop do when it's a woman? Right? And obviously, for obvious reasons, you can't, even as bad as Roman culture was, the bishop can't baptize a naked woman there. So the deaconesses assist the bishop, just as the deacon assists the bishop in baptism. The women would assist the bishop in holding up the curtain so that he could baptize a woman and keep these symbols that are very useful for expressing the nature of the sacrament, but without having scandal. So the bishop would baptize, and then the women would clothe the female being baptized with the white garment, and now she's baptized. So because of this connection with the bishop, just like deacons, they were given the feminine title in Greek for a deacon, and that's kind of the origin of it. Although, they won't tell you that today, of course.
Right.
And things of this sort.
Yes.
But let's go back to the indelible mark of holy orders, which, of course, of the three characters that are imparted by the sacraments of baptism, confirmation, and order, it's the greatest of all three characters.
Correct.
So how is it that, because it's necessary for service of the altar, but even back in the Middle Ages, laymen were permitted to assist the priest at the altar to serve Mass and everything. So how did they explain that a layman can be an acolyte or what have you, but he doesn't have the mark of holy orders?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that question up, because if you actually look at the discussion of it, and which is actually part of even in the Church's history up until just recently, even in the Old Rite, is that if a man had the holy order of acolyte, he had the right of serving at the altar, and you were to use his service at the altar over someone who did not receive that. So historically, the church, in order to assist the priest and able to say Mass well or easily, they would allow, as a toleration, certain laymen in order to serve at the altar, lacking someone who had these orders. And so it was really more of a, not a toleration as such, but just a supplying of something in order to facilitate the priest's offering of the sacrifice.
Right. Because until about, I believe, early in the 20th century, a priest actually had to have a server in order to say Mass.
Correct. That's right, yeah. And even now, the church still wants you to have it. It just doesn't have the same, if I understand it correctly, it doesn't have the same canonical binding that it did in the past. In the past, they were very serious. You had to have someone serve with you at the Mass.
Yeah.
So that's why that was actually done. Why just men? Because of the fact that to maintain that continuity of the representation of Christ as a man and the priest as a man, etc.
It's interesting, too, that when you look at the legislation on choirs, that men, because we think of choirs, you set the back up in the choir loft, but in actuality, right, the choir, the schola, was actually in the chancel, in the word's not coming correctly. I'll think of it tonight when I wake up in the middle of the night or something like that. But nevertheless, the choir. I'm sorry.
That's right. Yeah.
That was the term I was trying to come up with. My brain wasn't cooperating. So the choir is set up, and that's where they were, and they were clerics. They were all tonsure clerics
inside the sanctuary.
Yes, and so when you look at the legislation, even from Pius X and then also Pius XII, they're clearly, this is clearly what's favored, and so if women were to sing in choirs, they had to, Pius X says they have to basically be unseen. They have to be, screened off or in the back or put somewhere where they're not in visible view. Not because of, so you say, the church doesn't like women. Well, it's because they're fulfilling the role of clerics.
That's right.
So much as altar boy, because clerics are only men. Now, I guess the very last question for us then today should be, as you reference Sacerdotes Ordinatales of St. John Paul II, what about what is the raison d'etre, that is the theological, that's probably the wrong term to use. What's the theological grounding and explanation for why it has to be a man? Why couldn't it be a woman?
Well, I can give you different reasons theologically that have occurred historically. The first is that to be in persona Christi, Christ was male, and as a result of that, it was his play. Men should be in that image of his persona. The second component is that if you actually look, this actually goes all the way back to Genesis, when God said to when he was dealing out the various punishments to Adam and Eve, he said to Adam, he said, because you've done this, you shall work all the days of your life in thorns and thistles. So that in point in fact, it was to offer sacrifice, to suffer and to be sacrificial was proper to masculinity. As a result of that, which is obviously collapsed today because men are very selfish and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. But there's that element of has to do with the proper roles of a man in being sacrificial, and whereas ironically, the wife is on the receiving end of that sacrifice. She's the one that's supposed to receive the fruits of that, just like Christ, who is masculine, offers himself as sacrifice. The church, he does it for the church, which is often put in the feminine, that she receives as his bride. She receives the fruits of that. So there's that imagery and that symbolism. St. Thomas gives a couple of other reasons, but I think that the primary reason has to do with this. The structure and nature of the symbolism. Historically, women were not considered proper matter for the sacrament. And by matter we mean in the sense of because they were women and not men, and therefore couldn't stand in persona Christi according to the symbolism, you couldn't validly even ordain them. Now it's interesting because in Ordinatio Sacerdotales, John Paul II says is that the church was not given the faculty to ordain women. So what he did is, instead of trying to settle any theological question as to the reason why, it's the foundational reason, he just said that God just didn't give us the permission to do it, which, we can discuss the wisdom of that. I think there's a certain wisdom in it. I think the other thing is it'd be nice to have settled the question, but I can understand why he didn't. But the fact of the matter is that historically, women were just not considered valid matter for ordination. So, and that's one of the reasons why it would have been considered valid to even ordain them to the diaconate.
Indeed. Well, Father Ripperger, thank you very much for this wide range of questions. It was interesting as always.
Thank you, Ryan, for having me.
All right, where can people go to find more of your stuff?
Well, of course, there's, if you're looking for conferences and sermons, you can get them off of my website, Sensus Traditionis. It's www.sentrad.org. The other place is Sensus Fidelium, which is on YouTube. And then if you're looking for some of my writings, you can get them from Sensus Traditionis Press.
All right, Father Ripperger, thank you very much.
Thank you.